we're going to get underway, everybody. As I mentioned, my name's Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. We've got a couple of things to start us off with, and then jump right into our conversation. And before we do that, we'd like to acknowledge that we are all meeting on Indigenous land. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. And I'd like to share with you that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. And the land that I'm joining you from is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And, you know, Tamarack has the good fortune of working with a number of Indigenous nations across Canada, the Chippewa of the Thames and Kahnawake in Quebec, and really have learned a lot from our work with those nations, and that continues to inform how Tamarack thinks about our commitment to the truth and reconciliation process in Canada. So, as I mentioned, I'm Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I'm excited to welcome my colleague Cameron Norman to this webinar today, Imagining What's Next. This is the first of a 4-part series. We're going to be doing 2 webinars, and then we'll have 2 workshops that some of you might be interested in diving a little bit deeper in the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. And we're really pleased at Tamarack to be able to co-host this with Cameron. The first workshop is today, and then our second workshop will be in September. And I think that they are almost like the hors d'oeuvre for the dinner of the workshops. And the 2-part workshop series takes place in October 2021. Registration for the 2-part workshop series will be limited to 60 participants. We know we have more of you registered for this call. And we'll be sending you some more details about the second workshop in this, the second webinar in this series, and also the workshops. So I want to now pivot slightly and introduce you to Cameron, and really excited, Cameron, to be able to work with you both on the 2 webinars, but also on the workshop series. So I'm going to tell everybody a little bit about you from your bio. So Cameron is a professional designer, psychologist, evaluator, and educator, interested in the science and practice of innovation. Sense making started as a way for Cameron to share his thoughts on innovation. And I don't know if any of you have visited Cameron's website, Sense Making, but it's a great website to kind of go and visit. It's very provocative and lots of really good thinking on the website. He also uses it as a process for creating, designing, implementing, and evaluating new ideas and putting them in Word. And it's now blossomed. The website is now blossomed to over 500 posts and multiple learning channels. Cameron is the principal and president of Cense Limited, an innovation consultancy that helps organizations to design, develop, deploy, and evaluate innovation in human systems, particularly in the health and social sectors. He's also an adjunct professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health in the University of Toronto. So some of those words are a little hard to read, even though I did practice them, they're a little hard to read. But Cameron, so excited to have you join us for this first of 2 webinars. So if you were to introduce yourself, what would you tell people that might not necessarily be in your biography?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, one of the things that you can get a hint of is I love coffee. Now, I realize that that's probably shared by an awful lot of people. So, but I actually love I love coffee itself. I have until recently I've been roasting coffee as a hobby, but I also love the whole cafe experience of that. I know that that's one of those things that I think that probably is why I write and think and stuff like that. Almost anything that can happen at a cafe, talking, learning, reading, writing, thinking, all those things that we used to do, and hopefully we get to do very soon, is something that really fits with who I am. So I often think that that's like my bio, and you can even see if you visit my website that it's got a little bit of a hint to that.
Maybe some images of steaming cups of coffee, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's and I also probably get way too excited sometimes about things, so maybe that's part of it too.
Well, that certainly comes across in the website. Your kind of passion and your enthusiasm for innovation, but not only innovation, innovation at a human scale, which is what we're going to be talking about today, right? How do we apply the principles of design and innovation at a human scale? And that's what I'm really excited about
Yeah.
in terms of our conversation today. Hey, we're going to start off with a poll that my colleague Cameron or Connor is going to help us with. So Connor, maybe we can bring you on board. Oh, here we go. It should be popping up on your screen. And Cameron, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the 4 options in this poll.
Yeah. So when Liz and I, we've been having a number of great conversations in advance of designing this whole series. And one of the things we were talking about that got us starting to think a little bit about this was that it has been such a time of transformation in ways that's affected people in so many different ways. I mean, with the shared experience of COVID-19, but we've had things open up, close, and I don't mean just in terms of businesses and other things, but it's really given people a chance to change a lot, whether it's been by preference or not. And what it has done is that we were just this question came out of some conversations we've had just around how remarkable it's been to watch what's happened, how some people are thriving and some people are just keeping it together. And so no matter where you are, I mean, you are where you are. And I think from where we're coming from is that we want to see if we can try and think a little bit about getting you to imagine a little bit about maybe where you are now and how either you can keep things going if they're going well, or how you might be able to make a change for what's coming next.
Yeah, and we can see how people are posting things in the poll already. Maybe what we could do, we've got a couple more seconds of leaving the poll up. So
Yeah.
for those of you that are a little bit lagging or think, oh, maybe one of these options doesn't relate to me, feel free to jump in and post an option or just look at where we're landing with the other folks. I think for us,
Yeah.
Cameron, as we were thinking about this as well in our conversation, we thought, hey, the experience hasn't been the same for everybody
Yeah.
across the communities that we have worked with at Tamarack or the individuals that you've been chatting to. And so this for us will give us a sense of where everybody in this big virtual room is, but also as we think about designing the next webinar and the workshops, this is also going to be a little bit of informing us about that as well. So
Absolutely.
Connor, if you can close the poll, that would be great. So what I'm seeing is that a large number of people are they grew and are thriving as organizations and as individuals. And then the second highest response was that they say they stayed the same. There are less of you, 12%, who said we survived, but not much else. And then 25% of you for whom the pandemic had more negative repercussions. And so it's interesting to think about, we don't have a dominant group in any of these categories, but kind of sprinkling of folks across the 4 options.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It is interesting, and I think it reflects what we were talking about, is that the people are in very different places. And one of the things that is a quote from a book called The Leopard that I often like is the idea is that, and it alludes to this idea about how sometimes we have to change even to stay the same. So if things are going really well, that's great. But because so much around us is changing, we need to kind of keep moving, even if we want to keep the status quo the way it is. And I think that's part of where we're going with this series is you have to kind of keep moving and be intentional about what it is. And that's really what design, its part is all about.
So maybe that will lead us into the kind of first question, or maybe what we'll do first is this guided meditation, which is a question for the audience
Yeah.
as opposed to each of us. And so the question that we have, so we want you to, everybody who's on the call with us today, close your eyes for a minute and think back over the last 18 months. So think back to, March of 2020, or even a little bit before that when we started to hear about the pandemic, and, there were the rumblings around about this health thing that was probably going to affect us, and we didn't think much was going to happen, but there started to be this kind of increasing wave of concern about it. What did you notice, or what has surprised you the most over the last 18 months? So if you open up your eyes, maybe share your thoughts in the chat box. But what have you noticed? What has surprised you? What have you been thinking about? Ooh. And Cameron, maybe you can share
Yeah.
a couple of things that you might have been surprised about.
Yeah. Well, so one thing that I if you would have told me, so a couple of things that surprised me. So one of the things that had you told me all that was going to happen over just take 2020, never mind all the things that have happened in 2021, and you would have told me where I am now in terms of how I was feeling and what I was doing, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought, there's no way, but it surprises me. I saw somebody, one of the responses being resilience. I thought that was something that's quite interesting. But one of the things that's also interesting that I love is I've got some of my best friends and I, one of the things that we decided to do, like many people, is that when this pandemic started, is we just started doing a weekly call, and we've been doing it now for over a year. And whoever shows up, and we're geographically located all around the world. And what's so interesting is that we can have weeks where we're all going through the same thing, and yet it's very different. It has so much to do with where we are personally, where we are geographically, how even when you talk to people across the country in Canada or other places, almost the same things happening, but you've got different policies, you've got different reactions. It's amazing on just how different, and people that you may think that are thriving are struggling, and other people who you would have thought might have had a very difficult time are doing very well. And it changes each week. And that is one of those things that I noticed and surprised me, and including myself. I found I'm very poor at predicting how I'm going to react to certain things. And I don't know why I should be surprised, because that's how humans work, which I guess we'll talk a little bit about. But it's very interesting that we're not as good at predicting how things are going to go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the things that really surprised me, and we're seeing lots appearing in the chat box, but one of the things that I think surprises me and continues to surprise me is how the pandemic has such a big impact on people themselves, right? And how we have this kind of pandemic fatigue right now, and what that means, if you're a leader within an organization, and the amount of support that has to that you should be providing to your team and to your colleagues, and just that really human, very visceral kind of reaction to all of this, and the impact on employees with young children, and colleagues who are navigating, there lots of my friends are in that generation where you have elderly parents, and your children might have children, so just all of navigating all of those differences, and trying to figure out how to do that well, and what that can actually mean for me as an individual as
Yeah.
well. So there's tons happening in the
Wow.
chat box, and people, I think some of the happy hour stuff that you talked about, or those regular calls, lots of you are talking about things that you've done really well in your organizations, and then some stuff that has been more challenging, as you've navigated through this, places where you've collaborated really well, and then places where collaboration has maybe fallen off the table for some of you. And just looking at Nicole's
Yeah.
comment here, the ability to remain creative and productive despite the impact of the pandemic on our mental and physical health, and really loved how, because of Zoom, they've been able to connect with more people. So I think, that's really something that is a share between you and me and others. And then Anne talks about the capacity for change on a scale that we haven't seen in almost every aspect of our work and life. And I think
Wow.
you're absolutely right. It's the scope and the scale that sometimes can be overwhelming and sometimes freezes us in place. And I think Cameron, the what we're going to be talking about today really ties into all of these comments that we have. So keep them coming, and we appreciate them, and we'll use them as we think about webinar number 2 and come back and address them. So
Yeah.
let's get into the bulk of the conversation. And we know that guided meditation really looked at this notion of this level of remarkable change, the shared experience that we've had around this remarkable change. And you shared a little bit about what has captured your attention. If you think about it from a design perspective, what are some of the things that might have emerged for you from an innovation and design perspective?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think has done, this has the pandemic has really laid bare the strengths and weaknesses of our designs. And by that I mean is that just take, for example, our home. For, most of the time prior to the pandemic, without, obviously there's exceptions, but most of us were thinking about, well, this is a place where we sleep and we eat and we maybe entertain a little bit, and we keep our stuff, kind of stuff. But now all of a sudden, for a few months at least, there was a period where it was our everything. It was about safety. It was a place of entertainment. It was where we hosted everything, because even if it was virtually, we were always doing this. It was a place of work. It was school. It was our place of worship. It was everything. And one of the things that did, that I think surprised, is that people start to realize the design strengths and deficiencies. All of a sudden, things like having fresh air, boy, that's really important. It's not just healthy. It's really important. Like, if you could imagine, and there may be some people on the call who are in a place that didn't have access to ready, safe places outside, for example. The role your neighbors play, really, it's almost none of that was really a surprise, but what it is, it really captured my attention. And I think it's one of the things is you start to understand how things are designed well and not. And another good example, of course, is our public health systems. And we saw some amazing things happen. We saw some things that probably should have never happened. It exposed flaws in the system, and it revealed strengths simultaneously.
Yeah, I think across all systems, right? Our individual systems, and then the connections that we have to other systems, even when we all had to pivot to work from home, for many of us, some organizations did that fairly well, and others, there were bumps in the road, right, for them. And it took a while to make that pivot happen. And even for
Yeah,
some today, I know, with some of our government colleagues, for them to have the ability to enter onto a Zoom call requires them to use alternate technologies, right? And so, yeah, but we can see at Temrec that as the year progressed, people's ability to navigate technology became a lot easier as well, particularly virtual technology, because
yeah,
they were bridging between, what they were using in their work environment and what they were using in their family environment, or how they were connecting with others virtually. So yeah, lots has
absolutely.
really changed. So why, in this kind of year of change that we're all kind of experiencing together, and we're still experiencing it because we're not completely out, but we're starting to imagine what might be next. Why should we pay attention to design? What is it about that is so critical for this point in time?
Yeah. Well, everything that humans touch or create is designed. And we don't always think that way. Like, we don't kind of realize that. And I think that's one of the things that, of course, the pandemic or challenges expose. And you start to realize, we often tend to pay attention to things when they fail. And then we start to realize, oh wow, that wasn't really done very well, or it's not what we often call in design fit for purpose. is it was meant for one thing, but it wasn't meant for something else. And, a great example of this is if you take a look at how restaurants have responded, many restaurants, because a lot of times you can't do indoor dining and stuff. And what it started to do is that the reason why design is really important is design is about creating something for a purpose. And it may have multiple purposes and multiple people who are for that purpose there. But what it is that it's really conscious creation for use. That's one of the definitions that people often think about with design. But I think for this time in history, we've had so much that has been upended, and we've had a chance to see some very important systems exposed for their strengths and their liabilities, that we have a chance, because so much has changed because of the way people work, they relate, where they live, how they're, all those sorts of things. We have this very this special time. I want to call it special in the sense that much of that was done without planning, it's all been very reactionary. As things settle, that doesn't mean, I don't even want to use the term normal, but let's just say things settle a little bit. We have a chance to shape a little bit about how things land and start to think about all the changes that we made over the last 18 months, to think about what was working really well, what surprised us in a good way, and many of the people who responded in the chat have said there are some really surprising things that worked really well. Well, this is a chance for you to start to kind of solidify them. But at the same time there's a bunch of things that didn't work. And so this is really one of these opportunities for us to be very conscious, very mindful about what is it that we actually want, and how are we going to do it. Just to come back to the restaurant example is that restaurants were forced to really think, what do they do? And they do more than serve food. Like if you think about what makes a restaurant is it's a place for escape. It's a place for conviviality and being social. It's a place for meeting. Well, if you look at how some of the restaurants have managed, what they've said is, well, do we have to do that in a physical location? That's not to say that it's not better at a physical location, perhaps, but all of a sudden you saw these creative things, like you could do cocktail kits, or you could do little surprises, these online delivery things where you'd get courses on how to learn how to make something. People were making pre-prepared foods, all sorts of different things that were in a service of what their purpose was, as they saw it. I mean, for some places it's just about getting food into mouths, and that's okay too. But it really got people to think a little bit. And so for those industries, just to use it as one example, as we move into whatever this new settlement time is, we got to think maybe we want to keep some of that stuff.
Yeah, and I think that pausing, that reflecting is so critical to thinking about, okay, so as we begin to imagine what's next, what are the elements of design that, we might not have as intentionally thought about, but we want to bring forward into the next phase of the work. So
Yeah.
we're going to pivot slightly, because I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago, but you just wrote a couple of pieces
Yeah.
on your website about designing for humans. And so how does your thinking about designing for humans, how can it be applied for a kind of post-pandemic world?
Yeah. So those of you anybody who's on the, watching this and participating, might know a little bit about design. So there's this sort of a field of design. It's a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary area. And there's also something that's called human-centered design and things like that. But one of the things that most of the fields of design, and I'm not meant to necessarily be critical of them, is they're often designed for a client. And the client could be a government, it could be a business, it could be a nonprofit, it could be anybody. And they're designed to produce a specific kind of set of things. But if we're designing for humans, what that really is all about is thinking about, we've just gone through, again, 18 months that has really touched on what humanity is all about. We've had a chance to be our best. We've had a chance to be our worst. We've had a chance to be our most vulnerable. And we're in a place right now where really we're starting to do collective healing. And healing, if you think about how that term is phrased, and a lot of particularly First Nations cultures around the world think about healing as both a very, it can be a very positive thing. It's about growing. It's about that chance to grow from stress and from trauma. And so just to use one example, that the term, specific term healing, but if you look at muscles and things like that, what this is about designing for humans is designing for the kind of conditions that humans find themselves. So we find ourselves having to heal. We also find ourselves as humans, we are we are sometimes logical and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're rational, sometimes we're not. And all you have to do is take a look at the decisions the people have made, public figures, and even ourselves have made. And one of the things is that, but designing for humans is all about, this is sort of where the psychology of design comes in, is really starting to think a little bit about what is it that, who are we as people? And I know that sounds kind of, it's a big question, but we are vulnerable people and we are very strong, resilient people. And we're not like that day to day. To come back to kind of my reflection on just my friends, is that when you see that, we often like to design for things that are nice and stable, predictive, logical, a lot of evidence behind them and stuff like that. Well, we're in an innovative space, which is really what we are now, is we're creating something new, or at least something old in a new condition. Well, designing for humans means we need to think a lot more about those kinds of qualities, the qualities of vulnerability, the qualities of resilience, the fact that our preferences are evolving and changing, and they're really quite situational and that sort of thing, and who we are as people for our identity. So it's really about setting all of those things together and designing for real people, as opposed to designing for, there's this term user that's often used in design. And if you think about a user is like using something. But I think if you asked most people what they wanted and needed at the start of the pandemic and what they wanted and needed towards the end, it would have been very different. And it's not because necessarily so much, it's about exposure. It's about new ideas, new thinking about what they really need versus what they thought they needed.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think the conditions shift all the time as well. I mean, one of the things that we think about a lot at Tamarack is this notion of complexity, right? And that even as you begin to engage a community in change, the community responds and shifts as well. And if we've
Yeah.
not thought about anything over the course of the last year, I think what you just said, Cameron, is so interesting, right? What we thought we needed at the beginning in March of 2020, we needed safety and protection, and we were curious about this. And then, we kind of went into the darker days of, well, now we really have to hunker down and protect
Yeah.
ourselves. And now we're emerging out. So things are shifting all the time. And so, yeah, it's very interesting to kind of think about what's the human scale of the design. And not only the human scale for us as individuals, but then our organizations or the people that we serve. If we're a service oriented organization, what are they thinking about? Or, the community, if we're engaged at that level of change. So thinking about designing for humans at different scales as well
Yeah.
is really interesting. Hey,
Yeah.
so this was a thing that we explored in the last webinar that you and I did a couple of months ago about the power of one, and it ties into this kind of designing for humans idea. So why don't you
Yeah.
just let's revisit the smallest visible system again?
Yeah. So, one of the things that, there's a lot of talk right now about, designing for the new normal, the next normal, some things like this, building back better. I've heard that. And I like the spirit behind that, but oftentimes it's being framed as we need to change the whole system or change a whole systems, large. That isn't really at a human scale. That's not to suggest that we shouldn't try for it, but as individuals and organizations, we are part we operate our own little systems, but we're also part of other systems. And one of the things is it's so easy to get lost when you think about the big picture. There's so much to do. And if you actually look at how people change or even how systems change, almost all of it actually happens at a very small scale. But what it does is it has ripples and it ripples outward. So one of the things is that if you think about it, if you think about the civil rights movement, for example, Martin Luther King. When we think about Martin Luther King, we often think about him, I have a dream speech. We think about him at the front of the line doing marches and stuff like that. But one of the things that we often don't see, because it's not as interesting to us, this is why it's about designing for humans, because we like that stuff, is that we don't see that he spent a lot of time in church committees, doing administrative stuff, doing small things like getting on the phone about saying, come on out to this. And there's a lot of backroom things that happened that's fairly pedestrian that happened over 20, 30, 40 years of doing that. But he was able to do those things because he did the mundane, he did it every day, and he kept at it. And one of the things for him is he was looking at his smallest visible system with an eye to changing the whole system as a whole. And those people that were influential in that movement did the same thing. That's how change really happens, even though as humans, we get attracted to the big events, the big dramatic things. So the other reason why the smallest visible system is really helpful is it really helps us understand a little bit about what it is, what kind of impact we're having. Because the thing is, with so much happening, so many things interconnected, cascading to one another, it's very difficult to really understand what the effect of our actions are on things. I mean, despite our best intentions, we often do things that designer Charles and Ray Eames Charles Eames used to talk about the idea of some of the worst horrors in humanity have been done by design, by out of the best intentions. We had a good idea and it just didn't quite work out the way we thought it was going to. By scaling ourselves back to think, what kind of difference can I make right now? And what's the smallest visible system? Because then as you start to learn what's happening right around you, you can scale it out a little bit and push it out. And the reason why someone like Martin Luther King could take actions that would involve literally millions of people was because he took actions that involved 2 or 3 people. And he did it over the course of about 40 years and was able to understand it was about his smallest visible system just kept getting bigger, even though he had a vision that extended far beyond that system.
We often talk about that as looking at the grassroots and the grass tops, right? The bird's eye and the worm's eye view.
Exactly.
Hey, so you have, as we're thinking about this series, you've kind of put together a little bit of, I call it a design helix, which is going to inform our series, but wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about this.
Sure. This is a bit of so those of you who are joining, this is going to be a little bit of a preview of what we might see, which we'll talk a little bit in later to here. But so what this is that this is kind of just a model. So those of you who may or may not have ever heard of something called design thinking. And really what it is the process of kind of thinking about how things get made. One of the challenges with that, with any type of these sorts of models, is that they are just models. They are kind of ideas. It's trying to take together a lot of different things that we do as humans and individuals and try to create something for purpose. And how do you condense that into something that can be explained? But if you think about it, good design is about sort of seeing what might be, because we're always designing for the future, and the future might be tomorrow. But it's like, how do we do some things today so that tomorrow, when we wake up, things are a little bit better? We've got a different organization, we've got a different way of communicating, we've got a different way of learning, something like that. And that involves a little bit of imagination. It's got to get us from, because tomorrow isn't here today, we have to start thinking a little bit about where things are going, what we want, how can we make that? Which gets us to the second piece, which is production, is that there's a difference between envisioning the future and there's a difference between actually going to make it. And I think this is oftentimes, you can see strategic planning collisions here all the time. We have great visions and stuff like this, but here's what we think our organization is going to do these things. But we actually got to make it happen. And that's really the production feature. So the idea of doing a helix, it was originally a bit of a corkscrew. But the idea of a helix is much more, to me, a little bit more organic. It's a lot more about the DNA of who we are. And if you think about DNA, DNA is the thing that is one of the big pieces that sets the course for something moving forward, but it's also it also is able to change. It's just a little harder to do once you kind of get things going. So what this is it sort of outlines a little bit of the stages of which design, how we sort of design and design think. Like we perceive something out there. We see situations, problems, opportunities. We start to learn a little bit about it, what's going on. So we start looking and listening, and that's really that discovering and uncovering and thinking, is this the problem that I see it to be? And is it as big as it is, or is the opportunity what I think? And then it's really this whole thing about sense making. And sense making, I love that word. It's obviously the name of my blog, but it's really about how do you sort through the mess that is our world around us? Like you're seeing all kinds of stuff. So on one hand, we're seeing, certain things happening, and on the other hand, we're seeing something else, and then a bunch of things that we're not even sure what it is we're actually looking at. That's actually pretty normal for a lot of different things. If whether we're trying to grow our business, our organization, improve our reach and impact in the community, whatever that is, sometimes it requires a little bit of time to figure that out. And then really that idea is starting to make things. This is what's so important about design, is rather than assume you're going to get it right, you start to play a little bit. That's like that animation. Take your ideas and start to imagine what might actually happen and build into something. And then usually what it is it's involved these other steps. Like you got to fit it. Like I said, design is about fit for purpose. Is you got to start to figure out is that what have I designed is actually fitting the people I'm designing it with or for. And sometimes, I can speak personally. I've designed some amazing things for myself, and then as I start to actually use them, I'm like, actually, this doesn't work for me at all. this works for what I think, who I think I am, not who I actually am. And so, then you have to go back to the drawing board, or at least tinker and play with it a little bit. That's that last piece is tinkering. And then really what it is that then if that's working, then you put it out into the world and share it. And if it's good with your smallest visible system, is you affect it. And hopefully you're affecting it for positive things. And then you kind of cycle it back. And you kind of keep doing this stuff. So it keeps moving. And that's what this next image is that you start to twist this into a thing. So it's a never, well, I don't want to say it's never ending, because at some point we decide that we no longer need what it is that we're doing, or it's no longer serving a purpose, or we're bored with it, or whatever that might be. But certain problems, like we have something like, for example, poverty, it's been with us a long time, it's probably as long as there's been humans. It might be with us in the future. Maybe it won't be. That might be one of those things. Wouldn't it be great is if that one cycles through to the end? But what we do is we learn off of each other, and we learn off of each successive iteration of this stuff, in a circle, on an ongoing basis. So just like as humans, is our DNA is fueling us as organisms as we live and grow and develop. Michael Quinn Patton, who you know quite well and has been a great friend to Tamarack, talks about developmental evaluation. Really what that's about is that it's about developing as humans, developing as organizations.
Yeah, and I think, over the course of the two webinars and the workshops, we're going to kind of dive in and apply the Helix in real time to our collective learning. And I think that's what really excites me, because it is a kind of that weaving in and out of imagination and production. And sometimes we sit more heavily in one part of it, right? It might be we're able to imagine a lot but not produce real change, or we produce a lot of real change, but it's more of the same as opposed to what that imaginative change might be.
Yeah, and Liz, that's exactly that's a perfect way of putting that, because the thing is that when we get stuck, we get into a rut of producing. One of the ways to get out of it is start to imagining. And likewise, if we spend way too much time imagining and don't actually produce anything, well, it sounds great. It's great for cocktail parties and stuff like that, but what are you actually doing, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the interweave. So the series
Yeah.
overall is called Designing for What's Next. And so what are those kind of skills that we need to be focusing on?
Yeah. Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about them, but yeah, what advice would you have?
Absolutely. So one of the things about design is that, humans are natural makers, but not all of us are necessarily good makers. We might be good at making things like maybe meals for our family, for ourselves. We may be good at crafting some hobbies for ourselves. But we're talking about putting things out into the world, and particularly if we're looking at community change or organizational change, we're going to have to make with other people. So that kind of becomes kind of important. Just like a lot of things in life, just like you might be a good person to talk to when you're down, sometimes you need to see a pro. Sometimes you need to see maybe a therapist and stuff like that. The same thing is true with design. Now, that doesn't mean that you actually have to go necessarily get a professional designer. You can actually learn those skills. So you can start to learn. There are ways to actually think a little bit about, so imagining what might be. There's a whole field called the foresight, for example, that takes data and starts to look a little bit about what might be, what might some futures look like. There's some great tools around things like generating ideas, and it goes well beyond brainstorming. It's about really starting to think a little bit about stretching our creative muscles and thinking a little bit more, because the more ideas we generate, and the more even unusual ones, the more likely we might see something that fits really well with who we are, not just what we think we need, but what actually fits really well. Once you learn a little bit how to make things, and I don't mean we all know how to make stuff, but there's ways to make things that are more efficient or effective and more likely to produce the kind of things that we want. That's really what design is about. So these are those kinds of skills that I would say are basically tapping into stuff that is very human, very it's all stuff we know, but oftentimes because we haven't thought about it as design skills, we haven't necessarily thought about what exactly are we creating as a group. That's the difference to it. So what I like to think about is that it's tapping into something that will feel very comfortable, and at the same time will probably make you feel a little uncomfortable too, because all of a sudden it's like going, if I really want the world to be different, or I want the world to be better, or I want the world to stay the same, and even if everything else is moving, I have to make some choices and I have to take some actions. And what design is bringing those things together to helping you see what's happening, make better choices, and take better actions strategically. So that's really what it's all about. So I also think it's a heck of a lot of fun too. So that's kind of the upside. But it is that these great products, services, policies, those sorts of things are ones that are actually very well designed.
Yeah, and it leads me back into your comment at the very beginning that everything around us is designed, right? Even as you said that earlier, I was thinking about this webinar and the calls that we put in prior to today, where we were designing, the questions and how we would have this conversation and what we were thinking about. Hey, so I'm
Yeah,
gonna engage you in this last question, but before I do, just
yeah,
want to signal to people who might have a question that you want to pose to Cameron to put it into the Q&A box. And Stephanie will bring those forward, or if they're already in the chat, she's also monitoring the chat. So after this question, between you and I,
yeah,
Cameron, we're going to open it up to questions from the folks on the call. So the series. So this is a
yeah.
four-part series. What are we going to cover in the September webinar, and then in the workshops? What
Yeah.
are the things that everybody has to look forward to?
So if it may, hopefully it's not going to surprise people on this, but Liz and I actually applied some of this thinking to our own to this whole series. And one of the things we're realizing is that this is a special time. Is that as you can see, and I obviously it's not for everywhere, because we've got people joining from all over the world right now. But if you think about where we are in Canada, where most of us are, we are very fortunate to be in a situation where we've got a lot of vaccines. Our public health measures are working really well. Most of us are still kind of doing our part, and things are opening up. So it's giving us a chance to think a little bit about. It's also happening at a time of year where it's sunny, it's warm, people are outside, we tend to be a little more social this time. So one of the things that we thought about was, how do we use this moment right now as kind of people are starting to transition? So if you've got kids, they're kind of finishing off school, you might be thinking about vacations, even if it's another staycation or something like that. Maybe reading some books, those sorts of things. How do we use this as a bit of a provocation to get you to think a little bit over the next few months about, where do you want to go? Where do you want your organization to go? Maybe where do you want yourself as a person to go? Where do you want your community to go? And that's not usually something that you should be able to answer at a drop of a hat. It's something that requires a little bit of thought. But what we're going to do in September is come back as a group, and maybe with some more people as well, and start to think a little bit about, how do we not just think about the future and what it might look like, but start to look practically at, how do we take those ideas and start to sort through some of them, and start actually think a little bit about, more specifically, about how we apply design to designing for what our next is going to be, individually, collectively, together. And then the workshop is where it's going to give you that chance to be able to do that. So those of you who are interested in this, is we're actually going to go through 2 different workshops. Is you're going to learn the skills for better, seeing some of the potential futures, a little bit around coming up with ideas and doing it really well. How do you start to kind of think a little bit about crafting that and sense make, pull that stuff together, working with other people to generate better solutions than you could have on your own. And then between that, what we've set it up for is really want you to take a challenge, something that you want to commit to and you want to make to, and you're obviously not held to it, but you get a chance to work through it, because we like to, it's really a great idea to actually do this in practice. It's easy to think about this, and I recognize this, so this is why we've designed it this way. It's so easy to talk about this stuff. Once you actually start making it, you've got to go, geez, I've never made this before. It's a little scary. But that's why we're doing it together. So you'll have actually access to some coaching. We'll have a chance to have people come together in between these workshops to help you build something. And think about smallest visible product. You don't have to change your entire organization. Maybe just change a few small things that you might want to do. And then we come back for the second workshop, and it's all about taking those things and thinking about, how do you prototype, prototyping, what does it mean? What were you able to create in the meantime? And then how do you actually build that out and scale it? So it's going to be following that Helix model. So you kind of, all puns intended, it's about building that design DNA into your system.
I think it's going to be very exciting to kind of go through the process. But for those of you that are only going to participate in the webinar part, it's still going to be really helpful, because we're going to, in the next webinar, spend more time in the Helix, and then the different points in the Helix, the different points of imagination and production. So hopefully,
Absolutely.
the webinar series will be helpful as well. Hey,
Yes.
before we turn to questions, we had one more thing that we wanted to do, which is to again have a poll with everybody who's on the call. So where do you see yourselves and your organization in the next 18 months? So our first poll was reflecting backwards. Now we want you to reflect forwards. And so we'll give you a minute or so to answer this. And this one, what we're starting to see in just the early answers is a lot of people are imagining themselves growing and thriving as an organization and individuals. And then some of you are keeping yourselves consistent and stable, a little bit less, 12%. And some of you are just waiting in on managing and coping with the losses that you've sustained. That's 2%. So interesting to see how this poll is different than the poll that we had at the beginning of the webinar. Hey, Cameron, thanks so much.